If you do not have a regular navy, you have a chance to defeat your opponent's naval power with land attacks. The Ukrainian army presents the best example of this by launching attacks on Ukrainian port cities occupied by Russia with ground attacks. The Ukrainian armed forces is gripping Russia's naval forces in the Sea of Azov and the Crimean Black Sea areas. Russia currently has 22 warships in the Black Sea. 15 of these ships are surface combatants, and most of the rest are amphibious ships. These Russian ships, as well as Russian submarine forces whose route is unknown, occasionally maneuver into the coastal areas of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian army does not want to allow the Russians to expand their offensive axis using their navy. For this, Ukrainians are targeting critical front lines such as Mariupol, Berdyansk and Mariupol. Russian forces were on the alert in Mariupol and Berdyansk ports, where the Ukrainian forces had been carrying out intense missile attacks for a week. Russian forces were helpless against Ukrainian missile and artillery attacks and could not prevent them. These ports have long been used as the main supply line for the Russian army. With a sharp move, the Russian Navy withdrew 14 warships and more than 40 Russian cargo and civilian ships from the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol. Ukraine struck fear into the heart of the Russian Navy, disrupted the Russian main supply lines, and prompted the withdrawal of the Russian Navy. With this move, Ukraine hit 3 birds with 1 stone. So how did the chain of attacks that forced the Russian Navy to withdraw 54 ships with the greatest humiliation in history develop? And how were the Russian generals helpless? Let's dive into the legendary Ukrainian offensive on the southern port fronts. There were reports that Russian ships had entered the port of Berdyansk and Mariupol. One of the videos posted on social media networks captured a cluster of Russian military equipment guarded by Pantsers 1 Sam at dock number 10. From the moment of this rupture, the Ukrainian armed forces and artillery units began to use an unbelievable war tactic. Ukrainian forces have begun to target Russian-occupied Ukrainian port cities and areas close to the sea on the southern front lines, putting the Russian Navy under ground attack. The first target of the Ukrainian army was the port city of Berdyansk and Mariupol. Here, a large number of Russian naval forces controlled the seaside of the city, but the Ukrainians launched a sudden missile and artillery attack on a very critical area close to the port of Berdyansk. At least 8 explosions occurred in the occupied Berdyansk region of the Zaporizhia region in recent days. Explosions were mostly occurring at Russian bases and arsenals in the airport and port area of Mariupol and Berdyansk. The explosions, which took the port under its influence, mobilized the Russians. Russian troops began to receive security equipment against possible different attacks. Telegram channels reported that Russian Navy ships and freighters escaped from the ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol after these explosions. According to local sources, Ukrainian forces allegedly used Storm Shadow missiles in their attacks targeting Berdyansk and Mariupol. Russian Navy warships, civilian ships, and cargo ships were located in these 2 critical ports. Currently, there are 8 Russian warships on the Crimea and Azov coasts. It is seen that 14 Russian warships and 40 Russian cargo and civilian ships have been withdrawn from Mariupol, Crimea, and Berdyansk ports. Currently, the Ukrainians have repeatedly targeted the port city of Berdyansk and Mariupol in the last week. For this reason, the Russians do not want to anchor their navy forces in this port permanently or for a long time. In fact, the concerns of the Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the top Russian generals carrying out the invasion are quite justified, because the Ukrainians expanded the attack area much more in order to expel the Russian Navy forces from port cities such as Berdyansk. Already signs that the Ukrainian army would blockade Berdyansk and drive Russian Navy forces out of this area were evident from a critical attack only 24 hours before the 8 explosions in Berdyansk. If you remember, the Ukrainians attacked the city of Pryazovia, which is located near the city, before targeting Berdyansk with 8 artillery attacks in order to distance the Russian Navy forces from the Black Sea, where southern Ukraine and the Crimea are located. Ukrainian forces launched a massive missile attack on objects critical to Russian troops in the occupied territory of Pryazovia. While the Russian naval forces suffered shock after shock, the Ukrainians were constantly attacking more heavily to drive Putin's ships completely out of the Berdyansk vicinity. Berdyansk seaport, which the Russian forces used as a logistics center for the delivery of ammunition and other military property by sea, and the coastal city of Pryazovia, located near this port, were very strategic points to take a step against the Russian Navy forces. According to the video released by local sources, it was revealed that the missiles fired by the Ukrainian forces penetrated the Russian air defense and reached the port. According to the information received from the local people at the moment, while the ambulances were on their way to the port, some Russian ships anchored near Berdyansk and Pryazovia were already leaving the port. This was not the first case of Russian rocket attacks on infrastructure objects. If you remember, before the last attacks in Berdyansk and Pryazovia, a series of explosions were heard on the outskirts of Berdyansk, accompanying the operation of the Russian air defense systems. Russian state agencies RIA Novosti and TASS, citing Ukrainian officials, reported that the Ukrainian armed forces carried out these attacks on Berdyansk before the anti-aircraft defense system was fired. According to preliminary information, the attack was carried out on rest centers in the village of Novopetrovka, near Berdyansk, where Russian forces are stationed. The recreation centers of Khimik and Vesna, located on the coast of the Sea of Azov, were hit on the same day. Powerful explosions were heard on the territory of the Azov cable plant in occupied Berdyansk. A column of smoke rose into the sky where the attacks had taken place. Russian military warehouses, allegedly located on the territory of the power plant, were attacked. After all these attacks in and around the city of Berdyansk, it turned out that many Russian Navy ships and surface combatants fled to safer areas rather than Berdyansk. The escape of the Russian Navy did not stop the Ukrainians. On the contrary, the Ukrainian forces, in addition to expelling the Russian naval forces in Berdyansk, also carried out ground attacks over Melitopol and managed to hijack the Russian ships in the areas close to the sea strip of the city. A series of loud explosions occurred in the occupied Melitopol area of the Zaporizhia region. Dense smoke was visible in the north of the city. This critical news was announced personally by Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov after the president. Also, residents of Melitopol reported more than 5 loud explosions which were well heard in the northern part of the city. After these striking attacks, Russian naval forces in the critical areas of the Sea of Azov and Melitopol began to flee towards the much safer ports of the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. Because nowadays, 9 Russian warships, including 2 missile carriers with a total of 6 Caliber-type cruise missiles, were on combat duty in the Black Sea. 7 Russian warships have been spotted in the Mediterranean, including a missile carrier with up to 4 Caliber-type cruise missiles on board. So for Russian ships escaping from the Ukrainian coast, such areas and ports were much safer to anchor. Even the Russians no longer trusted the maritime areas. They claimed to be safe off the Black Sea and Crimea. The reason for this was, of course, the drone attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces, because the Ukrainians were almost constantly besieging the peninsula with drones. For this reason, the Russians consider that even the controlled ports in Crimea pose a risk to their navy. Ukrainian officials also make critical assessments on this issue. Ukraine's Deputy Chief of Military Intelligence, Major General Vadim Skibitsky, stated that Russia has shifted most of its Black Sea Fleet warships from its main base in Crimea to safer waters on Russian soil. In an interview with a Kiev TV channel, Skibitsky reported that the Kremlin decided to relocate the ships for fear of missile and drone attacks. The official primary headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet is located in Sevastopol, the largest city in Crimea and the site of numerous drone strikes in recent weeks. While Ukraine has not admitted responsible for the drone strikes, Kremlin-appointed Sevastopol Governor Mikhail Roswell Ishayev stated that Kiev was behind the attacks, which reportedly caused a massive fire at an oil depot in the region last Saturday. While there were so many risky factors for Moscow, the relocation of the Russian Navy was, of course, inevitable. Russia's Naval High Command reinstated most of the ships of the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol to the Russian city of Novorossiysk. The main base and other Russian military installations in Sevastopol were currently heavily guarded. The Russians were equipping their positions to guard against attacks on this infrastructure. However, Moscow, who could not take the risks, had to carry out this relocation practice in order not to lose its navy forces. Currently, it was not the first time that the Russians had smuggled their navy from the Sevastopol home base to Novorossiysk. In the future, if the attacks of the Ukrainian forces continue to be successful in this way, we may even see Moscow's navy forces landing on the Russian mainland. The occupied southern cities of Ukraine, Crimea, and the Russian city of Krasnodar in the south, and the cities of Bryansk, Belgorod, Kursk, and Rostov-on-Don in the west form the main supply lines of the Russian army and feed the Russian army. Ukraine had to cut the lines, feeding the Russian army as a preview of the all-out counteroffensive. Unmanned aerial vehicles and powerful long-range missiles belonging to Kiev took action to wipe out Russian logistics, ammunition depots, oil facilities, and Russian formations in these areas. That's why Ukrainian forces simultaneously hit the ports, fuel depots, Russian positions, and arsenals in both Berdyansk, Mariupol, and Krasnodar this week. In addition, the cities of Belgorod and Rostov were also under heavy Ukrainian air attack as Ukraine's mighty storm shadows were over the ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk. Russian army assets, arsenals, and even ships were damaged. Thus, Ukrainian forces disrupted the main Russian logistics line in southern Ukraine. Now there was the starting point of the Russian main supply line for Ukraine. Ukraine knew that for this it had to turn to southern Russia. Krasnodar is at the other end of the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. The city is at the head of the main supply line feeding the Russian army in Crimea and Ukraine. The Russian army sent soldiers, ammunition, war vehicles, and fuel to the Crimea and other fronts via Krasnodar. In Krasnodar, the Russian supply lines are the Kerch Bridge for both the railway and the road. Fuel and supplies are transported to the occupied Mariupol and Berdyansk ports for the sea route from strategic points such as Taman Port, Novorossiysk Port, and to support. In other words, Krasnodar is one of the most strategic points feeding both Crimea and the Russian army. The position of Krasnodar makes it the primary target of Ukraine. For this reason, Krasnodar was unable to evade the Ukrainian airstrikes. Krasnodar, once Russia's most prosperous city, is now trembling with the winds of war. Earlier yesterday, drones attacked the Helplessly oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar Krai. Dramatic footage of flames reaching the skies at a Russian oil refinery has surfaced online after Russian authorities reported that the country had carried out a drone attack on 2 oil facilities in the Krasnodar region. Huge flames were seen in the videos showing the fire at the Helplessly facility. The governor of the region, Veniamin Kondratyev, wrote on Telegram that a drone attacked the Helplessly oil refinery in southwestern Russia during the night, causing a fuel distillation unit to catch fire. The fire broke out in an area of 100 meters squared. The fire was extinguished as a result of the efforts of the emergency teams who came to the scene. The Helplessly oil refinery is located in the south of Russia, not far from the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. The port of Novorossiysk was the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet until the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Since then, Russia has transferred the headquarters to the occupied port city of Sevastopol. A second incident was also reported by the Russian authorities at the Ilsk refinery at around 4 a.m. local time. On the same day, a major fire also occurred at the Ilsk oil refinery, about 55 kilometers northeast of Novorossiysk. Local officials claimed that a drone attack also caused the fire. Russian officials stated on social media that an unmanned aerial vehicle had crashed into the facility and stated that there was no material damage, loss of life, or fire. Russian officials added that the fallen apparatus was destroyed with explosives around 9:20 local time. For security reasons, these attacks and explosions are not the first in the city of Krasnodar, which connects Crimea to Russia. Last month, drone attacks on the Ilsk refinery on May 4th and May 5th were also reported by Russian authorities. The attacks caused fires at the facility. In recent weeks, there has been increasing reports of attacks on rail networks and oil refineries on Russian soil. Drone attacks were also reported in various regions of Russia, including the oil unit of the Druzhba pipeline refinery in the Tver region. The attacks were also touted as a flare of Ukraine's upcoming major offensive. The most striking of these attacks was the massive explosions in Crimea. As is known, Crimea is critical for Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. An oil tank in the Cossack Bay in Sebastopol, the target of the first attack in Crimea, turned into a blazing inferno regarding the first attack in the Cossack Bay in Sebastopol. The Ukrainian Military Secret Service claims that 10 oil tanks, with a capacity of 40,000 tons, were rendered unusable in the attack. This figure is a very serious loss for Russia. The second airstrike alarmed the Kremlin even more. The target of the second airstrike was the port of Taman, near the strategically important Kerch Strait bridge connecting Russia with Crimea. An oil storage tank caught fire in the village of Volna, near the port of Taman. Volna is Russia's only land link with the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula. Also, the city is located near the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is an important supply route for Russian forces in the midst of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Therefore, this situation may disrupt the connection and logistics of Crimea and Ukraine for Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's Black Sea port of Taman is preparing to suspend exports of highly explosive liquefied petroleum gas over concerns over drone attacks. Railway operators in Russia and Kazakhstan have already announced their plans to restrict cargo shipments to Taman, which accounts for about 7.5% of Russia's total LPG exports. 3 sources with direct knowledge of the situation stated that Taman will suspend the transportation of LPG, also known as propane and butane, due to the explosive nature of the fuel. Sources did not specify when the port will stop LPG handling and stated that existing stocks will be shipped first. 2 of the sources reported that LPG operations at the Taman Transit Complex, which has a cargo capacity of 20 million tons per year, will be suspended indefinitely. Taman Neftegaz, the operator of the Taman Transit Complex, which also handles crude oil and petroleum products, did not respond to a request for comment. According to the available data, railroad LPG supply to Taman, one of the suppliers of Russia and Kazakhstan, amounted to 192,000 tons in January through May. Last year, the complex shipped 328,000 tons of Russian and Kazakh LPG. Sources stated that for now the complex is handling LPG loads from stocks at the port. Other market sources claim that they are examining other routes to export LPG from Russia, including Poland and China. Concerns over drone attacks on Russian infrastructure are the latest example of how the conflict in Ukraine affects energy supply and how dependent Russia is on security in the Black Sea, where it sends fuel to world markets. On the other hand, an important logistics and supply center providing supplies to Russian troops is at the focal point of the attacks in Berdyansk. The long-range attack hit the Russian-held port city in the Sea of Azov. The attack on Berdyansk is another example of Ukraine's ability to hit Russian targets far beyond the front lines. An official said that the Russian-occupied port city of Berdyansk was hit by a Ukrainian missile the other day. Berdyansk, about 96 kilometers from the front lines, is the latest example of long-range targets that Ukraine can now hit thanks to donated weapons. This is at least the 4th attack on the port city in recent weeks. Following this latest attack, a Russian deployed official said that the attack was carried out by Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. It seems that Ukraine's attacks targeting important supply lines will gain momentum. These attacks will wear out Russian logistics a lot. Logistics is the most important vein that feeds the war. How can the military success of an army whose vein is damaged? The Ukrainians seem to have doubled down on their efforts to reduce Russian personnel as much as possible. As you remember, the Russians have been sending a lot of forces through Berdyansk to Tokmak and Melitopol. We have already seen a lot of strikes near Tokmak, and now the time has come for those who headed in the direction of Melitopol. Interestingly, it turned out that a significant increase in force concentrations has been noted near the Dnipro River, in particular near Krylovka and Fedorivka. When it comes to Kulakivka, this is one of the very few settlements in this region that serves as an important connection center as well as located far enough from the nearest Ukrainian position. However, even though the regular short-range artillery is not capable of reaching this target, Ukrainian Air Force still has the means necessary to reach this Russian base. Today, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that as a result of a Ukrainian precision strike on a Russian object near this village, the Ukrainians have inflicted around 500 losses on the Russians. Most of the killed soldiers are newly mobilized men. They finished their training in the camps inside Russia and were finally moved to the front. However, due to the bureaucratic nature of the Russian army, organizational issues are sorted extremely horribly. That is why the Russians were forced to deal with such bottlenecks and had to pack basically a whole tactical battalion group in one building because the plan for dispersing the forces had not been ready. That is why the Ukrainian official stated that this successful wave of precision strikes is only the beginning. As Russian troops continue to migrate, all the Ukrainians need to do is just trace them and then hit the packed building at the end destination. Judging by the scandals in the Russian media space about the continuous violation of the operational security measures by the soldiers, tracing them and identifying areas of forces, concentrations should not be too difficult. In fact, today, the Ukrainian Air Force conducted 13 strikes. These strikes targeted not only concentrations, but also command posts and ammunition depots. One of the most successful strikes is expected to be in Fedorivka. The information about Russian losses here is still being specified. The Russians also started to target Ukrainian objects today. A huge explosion was reported in Druzhkivka. Here the Russians have struck a closed ice skating ring, which the Ukrainians basically used as a hangar for ammunition and equipment. Soon after the explosion, a video emerged of firemen putting out the fire inside the hangar. Judging by the video, the hangar was not equipped for stationing people, which is not surprising as Ukrainian soldiers are usually stationed in small houses to keep the groups in small numbers. There was also no sign of secondary detonations, so it was definitely not an ammunition depot. Therefore, the hangar was highly likely used for hiding equipment such as drones, cars, or artillery. Another explosion was reported in Kramatorsk. The information about this particular strike is very scarce as of now. However, we know for sure that Kramatorsk is one of the most important military hubs in the region with a lot of industrial zones. So the goal here was highly likely Ukrainian artillery systems that have been causing them a lot of trouble lately. Nonetheless, it seems like the most important artillery systems HIMARS are constantly on the road right now. It looks like the Ukrainians are just going along the front line, raiding Russian bases and ammunition depots, and so far, pretty successfully over the last 3 or 4 days. The Ukrainians have inflicted around 2,000 irretrievable combat losses to the Russians. If Ukrainian officials are correct and this trend continues for a while, the Russians will have to launch another wave of mobilization very soon. Estonian Ministry of Defense commented on the potential of the Russian soldiers from the next wave of mobilization. They said that their quality will be even lower than of the first, and this conclusion is not surprising because the resources are not endless and Russia is unable to provide its troops with all the necessities at this stage. That is why, according to Ukrainian intelligence, the ill-equipped newly mobilized soldiers are used as cannon fodder by the professional forces that are standing right behind them.